Chapter 7 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 7. On the Dark Deck. Ease, of all good gifts the best, war and wave at last decree. Love alone denies us rest, crueler than sword or sea. William Watson. I am Columbus every time I cross, said Shirley. What lies out there in the west is an undiscovered country.
Then I shall have to take the part of the rebellious and doubting crew. There is no America, and we're sure to get into trouble if we don't turn back.
You shall be clapped into irons and fed on bread and water, and turned over to the Indians as soon as we reach land.
Don't starve me. Let me hang from the yard arm at once, or walk the plank. I choose the hour immediately after dinner for my obsequies.
Choose a cheerfuler word, pleaded Shirley.
I am sorry to suggest mortality, but I was trying to let my imagination play a little on the eternal novelty of travel, and you have dropped me down full fathom 5.
I'm sorry, but I have only revealed an honest tendency of character. Piracy is probably a more profitable line of business than discovery. Discoverers benefit mankind at great sacrifice and expense, and die before they can receive the royal thanks. A pirate's business is all done over the counter, on a strictly cash basis. They were silent for a moment, continuing their tramp. Fair weather was peopling the decks. Dick Claiborne was engrossed with a vivacious California girl, and Shirley saw him only at meals, but he and Armitage held night sessions in the smoking room, with increased liking on both sides.
Armitage isn't a bad sort, Dick admitted to Shirley. He's either an awful liar, or he's seen a lot of the world.
Of course, he has to travel to sell his glassware, observed Shirley. I'm surprised at your seeming intimacy with a mere peddler. And you, an officer in the finest cavalry in the world.
Well, if he's a peddler, he's a high-class one. Probably the junior member of the firm that owns the works.
Armitage saw something of all the Claibornes every day in the pleasant intimacy of ship life, and Hilton Claiborne found the young man an interesting talker. Judge Claiborne is, as everyone knows, the best posted American of his time in diplomatic history, and when they were together Armitage suggested topics that were well calculated to awaken the old lawyer's interest.
The glass-blower's a deep one, all right, remarked Dick to Shirley. He jollies me occasionally, just to show there's no hard feeling. Then he jollies the governor, and when I saw our mother putting it on his arm this afternoon, I almost fell in a faint. I wish you'd hold on to him till we're docked. My little friend from California is crazy about him, and I haven't dared to tell her he's only a drummer. Such a fling would be unchivalrous of me.
It would, Richard, but a generous foe, whether you can afford to be or not.
My sister, my own sister, says this to me. This is quite the unkindest. I'm going to offer myself to the daughter of the Redwoods at once.
Shirley and Armitage talked, as people will on shipboard, of everything under the sun. Shirley's enthusiasms were in themselves interesting, but she was informed in the world's larger affairs, as became the daughter of a man who was an authority in such matters, and found it pleasant to discuss them with Armitage. He felt the poetic quality in her. It was that which had first appealed to him. But he did not know that something of the same sort in himself touched her. It was enough for those days that he was courteous and amusing, and gained a trifle in her eyes from the fact that he had no tangible background. Then came the evening of the 5th day. They were taking a turn after dinner on the lighted deck. The spring stars hung faint and far through thin clouds, and the wind was keen from the sea. A few passengers were out. The deck stewards went about gathering up rugs and chairs for the night. Time oughtn't to be reckoned at all at sea, so the people who feel themselves getting old might sail forth into the deep and defy the old man with the hourglass.
I like the idea. Some people could become fishers, permanently, and grow very wise from so much brain food.
They wouldn't eat, Mr. Armitage. Brain food, forsooth. You talk like a breakfast food advertisement. My idea, mine, please note, is for such fortunate people to sail in pretty little boats with orange-tinted sails and pick up lost dreams. I got a hint of that in a pretty poem once. Time seemed to pause a little pace. I heard a dream go by.
But out here in mid-ocean,
A little boat with lateen sails wouldn't have much show. And dreams passing over. The idea is pretty, and creditable to your imagination. But I thought your fancy was more militant. Now, for example, you like battle pictures," he said, and paused inquiringly. She looked at him quickly. "How do you know I do?" "You like detail particularly." "Am I to defend my taste? What's the answer, if you don't mind?" "Detail is much to my liking also. But I prefer Flameng as a strictly personal matter. There was a wonderful collection of military and battle pictures shown in Paris last winter." She half withdrew her hand from his arm and turned away. The sea winds did not wholly account for the sudden color in her cheeks. She had seen Armitage in Paris, in cafes, at the opera, but not at the great exhibition of world-famous battle pictures. Yet undoubtedly he had seen her, and she remembered with instant consciousness the hours of absorption she had spent before those canvases. "It was a public exhibition, I believe. There was no great harm in seeing it." "No, there certainly was not," he laughed, then was serious at once. Shirley's tense, arrested figure, her bright, eager eyes, her parted lips, as he saw her before the battle pictures in the gallery of Paris, came up before him and gave him pause. He could not play upon that stolen glance, or tease her curiosity in respect to it. If this were ship flirtation, it might be well enough, but the very sweetness and open-heartedness of her youth shielded her. It seemed to him in that moment a contemptible and unpardonable thing that he had followed her about and caught her, there at Paris, in an exalted mood, to which she had been wrought by the moving incidents of the war. "I was in Paris during the exhibition," he said quietly. "Ormsby, the American painter, the man who did the High Tide at Gettysburg, is an acquaintance of mine." "Oh!" It was Ormsby's painting that had particularly captivated Shirley. She had returned to it day after day, and the thought that Armitage had taken advantage of her deep interest in Pickett's charging the gray line was annoying, and she abruptly changed the subject. Shirley had speculated much as to the meaning of Armitage's remark at the carriage door in Geneva, that he expected the slayer of the old Austrian prime minister to pass that way. Armitage had not referred to the crime in any way in his talks with her on the King Edward. Their conversations had been pitched usually in a light and frivolous key, or if one were disposed to be serious, the other responded in a note of levity. "We are all imperialists at heart," said Shirley, referring to a talk between them earlier in the day. "We Americans are hungry for empire. We're simply waiting for the man on horseback to gallop down Broadway and up Fifth Avenue with a troop of cavalry at his heels and proclaim a new dispensation." "And before he'd gone a block a big Irish policeman would arrest him for disorderly conduct or disturbing the peace, or for giving a show without a license, and the Republic would continue to do business at the old stand." "No, the police would have been bribed in advance, and would deliver the keys of the city to the new emperor at the door of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And His Majesty would go to Sherry's for luncheon, and sign a few decrees, and order the guillotine set up in Union Square. Do you follow me, Mr. Armitage?" "Yes, to the very steps of the guillotine, Miss Claiborne. But the looting of the temples and the plundering of banks, if the thing is bound to be, I should like to share in the general joy. But I have an idea, Miss Claiborne," he exclaimed as though with inspiration. "Yes, you have an idea?" "Let me be the man on horseback, and you might be—" "Yes, the suspense is terrible. What might I be, your Majesty?" "Well, we should call you—" He hesitated, and she wondered whether he would be bold enough to meet the issue offered by this turn of their nonsense. "I seem to give your Majesty difficulty. The silence isn't flattering," she said mockingly, but she was conscious of a certain excitement as she walked the deck beside him. "Oh, pardon me, the difficulty is only as to your title. You would, of course, occupy the dais, but whether you should be queen or empress, that's the rub. If America is to be an empire, then of course you would be an empress. So there, you are answered." They passed laughingly on to the other phases of the matter in the whimsical vein that was natural in her, and to which he responded. They watched the lights of an eastbound steamer that was passing near. The exchange of rocket signals, that pretty and graceful parley between ships that pass in the night, interested them for a moment. Then the deck lights went out so suddenly it seemed that a dark curtain had descended and shut them in with the sea.
Accident to the dynamo. We shall have the lights on in a moment," shouted the deck officer, who stood near, talking to a passenger. "Shall we go in?" asked Armitage. "Yes, it's getting cold," replied Shirley. For a moment they were quite alone on the dark deck, though they heard voices near at hand. They were groping their way toward the main saloon, where they had left Mr. and Mrs. Claiborne, when Shirley was aware of someone lurking near. A figure seemed to be crouching close by, and she felt its furtive movements and knew that it had passed but remained a few feet away. Her hand on Armitage's arm tightened. "What is that? There is someone following us," she said. At the same moment Armitage, too, became aware of the presence of a stooping figure behind him. He stopped abruptly and faced about. "Stand quite still, Miss Claiborne." He peered about, and instantly, as though waiting for his voice, a tall figure rose not a yard from him, and a long arm shot high above his head and descended swiftly. They were close to the rail, and a roll of the ship sent Armitage off his feet and away from his assailant. Shirley at the same moment threw out her hands defensively or for support, and clutched the arm and shoulder of the man who had assailed Armitage. He had driven a knife at John Armitage, and was poising himself for another attempt when Shirley seized his arm. As he drew back a fold of his cloak still lay in Shirley's grasp, and she gave a sharp little cry as the figure, with a quick jerk, released the cloak and slipped away into the shadows. A moment later the lights were restored, and she saw Armitage regarding ruefully a long slit on the left arm of his ulster. "Are you hurt? What has happened?" she demanded. "It must have been a sea serpent," he replied laughingly. The deck officer regarded them curiously as they blinked in the glare of the light, and asked whether anything was wrong. Armitage turned the matter off. "I guess it was a sea serpent," he said. "It bit a hole in my ulster, for which I am not grateful." Then in a lower tone to Shirley, "That was certainly a strange proceeding. I am sorry you were startled, and I am under greatest obligations to you, Miss Claiborne. Why, you actually pulled the fellow away." "Oh, no," she returned lightly, but still breathing hard. "It was the instinct of self-preservation. I was unsteady on my feet for a moment, and sought something to take hold of. That pirate was the nearest thing, and I caught hold of his cloak. I am sure it was a cloak, and that makes me sure he was a human villain of some sort. He didn't feel the least like a sea serpent. But someone tried to injure you. It is no jesting matter." "Some lunatic escaped from steerage, probably. I shall report it to the officers." "Yes, it should be reported," said Shirley. "It was very strange. Why, the deck of the King Edward is the safest place in the world. But it's something to have a hold of a sea serpent, or a pirate. I hope that you will forgive me for bringing you into such an encounter, but if you hadn't caught his cloak—" Armitage was uncomfortable, and anxious to allay her fears. The incident was by no means trivial, as he knew. Passengers on the great transatlantic steamers are safeguarded by every possible means, and the fact that he had been attacked in the few minutes that the deck lights had been out of order pointed to an espionage that was both close and daring. He was greatly surprised, and more shaken than he wished Shirley to believe. The thing was disquieting enough, and it could not but impress her strangely that he, of all the persons on board, should have been the object of so unusual an assault. He was in the disagreeable plight of having subjected her to danger, and as they entered the brilliant saloon he freed himself of the ulster with its telltale gash, and sought to minimize her impression of the incident. Shirley did not refer to the matter again, but resolved to keep her own counsel. She felt that any one who would accept the one chance in 1,000 of striking down an enemy on a steamer deck must be animated by very bitter hatred. She knew that to speak of the affair to her father or brother would be to alarm them and prejudice them against John Armitage, about whom her brother, at least, had entertained doubts. And it is not reassuring as to a man of whom little or nothing is known that he is menaced by secret enemies. The attack had found Armitage unprepared and off guard, but with swift reaction his wits were at work. He at once sought the purser and scrutinized every name on the passenger list. It was unlikely that a steerage passenger could reach the saloon deck unobserved. A second cabin passenger might do so, however, and he sought among the names in the second cabin list for a clue. He did not believe that Chauvenet or Durand had boarded the King Edward. He himself had made the boat only by a quick dash, and he had left those two gentlemen at Geneva with much to consider.
It was, however, quite within the probabilities that they would send someone to watch him, for the two men whom he had overheard in the dark house on the Boulevard Froissart were active and resourceful rascals, he had no doubt. Whether they would be able to make anything of the cigarette case he had stupidly left behind he could not conjecture, but the importance of recovering the packet he had cut from Chauvenet's coat was not a trifle that rogues of their caliber would ignore. There was, the purser said, a sick man in the second cabin, who had kept close to his berth. The steward believed the man to be a Continental of some sort, who spoke bad German. He had taken the boat at Liverpool, paid for his passage in gold, and, complaining of illness, retired, evidently for the voyage. His name was Peter Ludovic, and the steward described him in detail. "Big fellow, bullet head, bristling mustache, small eyes." "That will do," said Armitage, grinning at the ease with which he identified the man. "You understand that it is wholly irregular for us to let such a matter pass without acting," said the purser. "It would serve no purpose, and might do harm. I will take the responsibility." And John Armitage made a memorandum in his notebook. Zmai travels as Peter Ludovic. Armitage carried the envelope which he had cut from Chauvenet's coat pinned into an inner pocket of his waistcoat, and since boarding the King Edward he had examined it twice daily to see that it was intact. The 3 red wax seals were in blank, replacing those of like size that had originally been affixed to the envelope, and at once after the attack on the dark deck he opened the packet and examined the papers, some half-dozen sheets of thin linen, written in a clerk's clear hand in black ink. There had been no mistake in the matter. The packet which Chauvenet had purloined from the old Prime Minister at Vienna had come again into Armitage's hands. He was daily tempted to destroy it and cast it in bits to the sea winds, but he was deterred by the remembrance of his last interview with the old Prime Minister. "Do something for Austria, something for the Empire." These phrases repeated themselves over and over again in his mind, until they rose and fell with the cadence of the high, wavering voice of the Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna, as he chanted the Mass of Requiem for Count Ferdinand von Stroebel. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 8. The King is Dead. Long live the King. Low he lies, yet high and great, looms he, lying thus in state. How exalted o'er ye when dead, my lords and gentlemen. James Whitcomb Riley. John Armitage lingered in New York for a week, not to press the Claibornes too closely, then went to Washington. He wrote himself down on the register of the New American as John Armitage, Sink Tight, Montana, and took a suite of rooms high up, with an outlook that swept Pennsylvania Avenue. It was on the evening of a bright April day that he thus established himself, and after he had unpacked his belongings, he stood at the window and watched the lights leap out of the dusk over the city. He was in Washington because Shirley Claiborne lived there, and he knew that even if he wished to do so, he could no longer throw an air of inadvertence into his meetings with her. He had been very lonely in those days when he first saw her abroad. The sight of her had lifted his mood of depression, and now, after those enchanted hours at sea, his coming to Washington had been inevitable. Many things passed through his mind as he stood at the open window. His life, he felt, could never be again as it had been before, and he sighed deeply as he recalled his talk with the old Prime Minister at Geneva. Then he laughed quietly as he remembered Chauvenet and Durand and the dark house on the Boulevard Froissart. But the further recollection of the attack made on his life on the deck of the King Edward sobered him, and he turned away from the window impatiently. He had seen the sick second cabin passenger leave the steamer at New York, but had taken no trouble either to watch or to avoid him. Very likely the man was under instructions, and had been told to follow the Claibornes home, and the thought of their identification with himself by his enemies angered him. Chauvenet was likely to appear in Washington at any time, and would undoubtedly seek the Claibornes at once. The fact that the man was a scoundrel might, in some circumstances, have afforded Armitage comfort, but here again Armitage's mood grew dark. Jules Chauvenet was undoubtedly a rascal of a shrewd and dangerous type. But who, pray, was John Armitage? The bell in his entry rang, and he flashed on the lights and opened the door. "Well, I like this! Setting yourself up here in gloomy splendor and never saying a word. You never deserved to have any friends, John Armitage." "Jim Sanderson, come in." Armitage grasped the hands of a red-bearded giant of 40, the possessor of alert brown eyes and a big voice.
"It's my rural habit of reading the register every night in search of constituents that brings me here. They said they guessed you were in, so I just came up to see whether you were opening a poker game or had come to sneak a claim past the watchdog of the Treasury."
The caller threw himself into a chair and rolled a fat, unlighted cigar about in his mouth.
"You're peach, all right, and as offensively hale and handsome as ever. When are you going to the ranch?"
"Well, not just immediately. I want to sample the flesh pots for a day or two."
"You're getting soft. That's what's the matter with you. You're afraid of the spring zephyrs on the Montana range. Well, I'll admit that it's rather more diverting here."
"There's no debating that, Senator. How do you like being a statesman? It was so sudden and all that. I read an awful roast of you in an English paper. They took your election to the Senate as another evidence of the complete domination of our politics by the plutocrats." Sanderson winked prodigiously.
"The papers have rather skinned me. But on the whole, I'll do very well. They say it isn't respectable to be a senator these days, but they oughtn't to hold it up against a man that he's rich. If the Lord put silver in the mountains of Montana and let me dig it out, it's nothing against me, is it?"
"Decidedly not. And if you want to invest it in a senatorship, it's the Lord's hand again."
"Why, sure."
And the senator from Montana winked once more.
"But it's expensive. I've got to be elected again next winter. I'm only filling out Billings' term, and I'm not sure I can go up against it."
"But you are nothing if not unselfish. If the good of the country demands it, you'll not falter, if I know you."
"There's hot water heat in this hotel, so please turn off the hot air. I saw your foreman and Helena the last time I was out there, and he was sober. I mention the fact, knowing that I'm jeopardizing my reputation for veracity, but it's the Lord's truth. Of course you spent Christmas at the old home in England, one of those Yule log and plum pudding Christmases you read about in novels. You Englishmen."
"My dear Sanderson, don't call me English. I've told you a dozen times that I'm not English."
"So you did. So you did. I'd forgotten that you're so damned sensitive about it."
And Sanderson's eyes regarded Armitage intently for a moment, as though he were trying to recall some previous discussion of the young man's nativity. "I offer you a free swing at the bar, Senator. May I summon a Montana cocktail? You taught me the ingredients once. 3 dashes orange bitters, 2 dashes acid phosphate, half a jigger of whiskey, half a jigger of Italian vermouth. You undermined the constitutions of half Montana with that mess." Sanderson reached for his hat with sudden dejection.
"The sprinkling cart for me. I've got a nerve specialist engaged by the year to keep me out of sanatoriums. See here, I want you to go with us tonight to the Secretary of State's push. Not many of the Montana boys get this far from home, and I want you for exhibition purposes. Say, John, when I saw Cinch Tight, Montana, written down on the register there, it increased my circulation 7 beats. You're all right, and I guess you're about as good an American as they make, anywhere, John Armitage."
The function for which the senator from Montana provided an invitation for Armitage was a large affair in honor of several new ambassadors. At 10 o'clock Senator Sanderson was introducing Armitage right and left as one of his representative constituents. Armitage and he owned adjoining ranches in Montana, and Sanderson called upon his neighbor to stand up boldly for their state before the minions of effete monarchies. Mrs. Sanderson had asked Armitage to return to her for a little Montana talk, as she put it, after the first rush of their entrance was over, and as he waited in the drawing-room for an opportunity of speaking to her, he chatted with Franzel, an attaché of the Austrian embassy, to whom Sanderson had introduced him. Franzel was a gloomy young man with a monocle, and he was waiting for a particular girl who happened to be the daughter of the Spanish ambassador. And, this being his object, he had chosen his position with care, near the door of the drawing-room, and Armitage shared for the moment the advantage that lay in the Austrian's point of view. Armitage had half expected that the Claibornes would be present at a function as comprehensive of the higher official world as this, and he intended asking Mrs. Sanderson if she knew them as soon as opportunity offered. The Austrian attaché proved tiresome, and Armitage was about to drop him, when suddenly he caught sight of Shirley Claiborne at the far end of the broad hall. Her head was turned partly toward him. He saw her for an instant through the throng. Then his eyes fell upon Chauvenet at her side, talking with liveliest animation. He was not more than her own height, and his profile presented the clean, sharp effect of a cameo. The vivid outline of his dark face held Armitage's eyes. Then, as Shirley passed on through an opening in the crowd, her escort turned, holding the way open for her, and Armitage met the man's gaze. It was with an accented gravity that Armitage nodded his head to some declaration of the melancholy attaché at this moment. He had known when he left Geneva that he had not done with Jules Chauvenet, but the man's prompt appearance surprised Armitage. He ran over the names of the steamers by which Chauvenet might easily have sailed from either a German or a French port and reached Washington quite as soon as himself. Chauvenet was in Washington, at any rate, and not only there, but socially accepted and in the good graces of Shirley Claiborne. The sombre attaché was speaking of the Japanese. "They must be crushed, crushed," said Franzel. The two had been conversing in French. "Yes, he must be crushed," returned Armitage absent-mindedly in English. Then, remembering himself, he repeated the affirmation in French, changing the pronoun. Mrs. Sanderson was now free. She was a pretty, vivacious woman, much younger than her stalwart husband, a college graduate whom he had found teaching school near one of his silver mines. "Welcome once more, constituent. We're proud to see you, I can tell you. Our host owns some marvelous tapestries, and they're hung out tonight for the world to see." She guided Armitage toward the secretary's gallery on the upper floor. Their host was almost as famous as a connoisseur as for his achievements in diplomacy, and the gallery was a large apartment in which every article of furniture, as well as the paintings, tapestries, and specimens of pottery, were the careful choice of a thoroughly cultivated taste. "It isn't merely an art gallery. It's the most beautiful room in America," murmured Mrs. Sanderson. "I can well believe it. There's my favorite Vibert. I wondered what had become of it." "Isn't it surprising that the secretary is making a general reputation by his dealings with foreign powers? It's a poor ambassador who could not be persuaded after an hour in this splendid room. The ordinary affairs of life should not be mentioned here. A king's coronation would not be out of place. In fact, there's a chair in the corner against that Gobelin that would serve the situation. The old gentleman by that cabinet is the Baron von Marhof, the ambassador from Austria-Hungary. He's a brother-in-law of Count von Stroebel, who was murdered so horribly in a railway carriage a few weeks ago." "Ah, to be sure. I haven't seen the Baron in years. He has changed little." "Then you knew him, in the old country?" "Yes, I used to see him, when I was a boy," remarked Armitage. Mrs. Sanderson glanced at Armitage sharply. She had dined at his ranch house in Montana, and knew that he lived like a gentleman, that his house, its appointments and service, were unusual for a Western ranchman. And she recalled, too, that she and her husband had often speculated as to Armitage's antecedents and history, without arriving at any conclusion in regard to him. The room had slowly filled, and they strolled about, dividing attention between distinguished personages and the not less celebrated works of art. "Oh, by the way, Mr. Armitage, there's the girl I've chosen for you to marry. I suppose it would be just as well for you to meet her now, though that dark little foreigner seems to be monopolizing her." "I am wholly agreeable," laughed Armitage. "The sooner the better, and be done with it." "Don't be frivolous. There, you can look safely now. She stopped to speak to that bald and pink Justice of the Supreme Court, the girl with the brown eyes and hair. Have a care." Shirley and Chauvenet left the venerable Justice, and Mrs. Sanderson intercepted them at once. To think of all these beautiful things in our own America!" exclaimed Shirley. "And you, Mr. Armitage?" "Among the other curios, Miss Claiborne," laughed John, taking her hand. "But I haven't introduced you yet," began Mrs. Sanderson, puzzled. "No, the King Edward did that. We crossed together. Oh, Monsieur Chauvenet, let me present Mr. Armitage," said Shirley, seeing that the men had not spoken. The situation amused Armitage, and he smiled rather more broadly than was necessary in expressing his pleasure at meeting Monsieur Chauvenet. They regarded each other with the swift intentness of men who are used to the sharp exercise of their eyes, and when Armitage turned toward Shirley and Mrs. Sanderson, he was aware that Chauvenet continued to regard him with a fixed gaze. Miss Claiborne is a wonderful sailor. The Atlantic is a little tumultuous at times in the spring, but she reported to the captain every day. "Miss Claiborne is nothing if not extraordinary," declared Mrs. Sanderson, with frank admiration. "The world seems to have been coined for her," said Chauvenet, his white teeth showing under his thin black moustache. "And still leaves the language distinguished chiefly for its poverty," added Armitage, and the men bowed to Shirley and then to Mrs. Sanderson and again to each other. It was like a rehearsal of some trifle in a comedy. "How charming!" laughed Mrs. Sanderson. "And this lovely room is just the place for it." They were still talking together as Franzel, with whom Armitage had spoken below, entered hurriedly. He held a crumpled note, whose contents, it seemed, had shaken him out of his habitual melancholy composure. "Is Baron von Marhof in the room?" he asked Armitage, fumbling nervously at his monocle. The Austrian ambassador, with several ladies, and led by Senator Sanderson, was approaching. The attaché hurried to his chief and addressed him in a low tone. The ambassador stopped, grew very white, and stared at the messenger for a moment in blank unbelief. The young man now repeated, in English, in a tone that could be heard in all parts of the hushed room: "His Majesty, the Emperor Johann Wilhelm, died suddenly tonight in Vienna," he said, and gave his arm to his chief. It was a strange place for the delivery of such a message, and the strangeness of it was intensified to Shirley by the curious glance that passed between John Armitage and Jules Chauvenet. Shirley remembered afterward that as the attaché's words rang out of the room, Armitage started, clenched his hands, and caught his breath in a manner very uncommon in men unless they are greatly moved. The ambassador walked directly from the room with bowed head, and everyone waited in silent sympathy until he had gone. The word passed swiftly through the great house, and through the open windows the servants were heard crying loudly for Baron von Marhof's carriage in the court below. "The king is dead. Long live the king," murmured Shirley. "Long live the king," repeated Chauvenet and Mrs. Sanderson in unison, and then Armitage, as though mastering a phrase they were teaching him, raised his head and said, with an unction that surprised them, "Long live the Emperor and King! God save Austria!" Then he turned to Shirley with a smile. "It is very pleasant to see you on your own ground. I hope your family are well." "Thank you, yes. My father and mother are here somewhere." "And Captain Claiborne?" "He's probably sitting up all night to defend Fort Myer from the crafts and assaults of the enemy. I hope you will come to see us, Mr. Armitage." "Thank you. You are very kind," he said gravely. "I shall certainly give myself the pleasure very soon." As Shirley passed on with Chauvenet, Mrs. Sanderson launched on the girl's praises, but she found him suddenly preoccupied. "The girl has gone to your head. Why didn't you tell me you knew the Claibornes?" "I don't remember that you gave me a chance. But I'll say now that I intend to know them better." She bade him take her to the drawing room. As they went down through the house they found that the announcement of Emperor Johann Wilhelm's death had cast a pall upon the company. All the members of the diplomatic corps had withdrawn at once, as a mark of respect and sympathy for Baron von Marhof, and at midnight the ballroom held all of the company that remained. Armitage had not sought Shirley again. He found a room that had been set apart for smokers, threw himself into a chair, lighted a cigar, and stared at a picture that had no interest for him whatever. He put down his cigar after a few whiffs, and his hand went to the pocket in which he usually carried his cigarette case. "Ah, Mr. Armitage, may I offer you a cigarette?" He turned to find Chauvenet close at his side. He had not heard the man enter, but Chauvenet had been in his thoughts, and he started slightly at finding him so near. Chauvenet held in his white-gloved hand a gold cigarette-case, which he opened with a deliberate care that displayed its embellished side. The smooth golden surface gleamed in the light, the helmet in blue, and the white falcon flashed in Armitage's eyes. The meeting was clearly by intention, and a slight smile played about Chauvenet's lips in his enjoyment of the situation. Armitage smiled up at him in amicable acknowledgment of his courtesy, and rose. "You are very considerate, monsieur. I was just at the moment regretting our distinguished host's oversight in providing cigars alone. Allow me." He bent forward, took the outstretched open case into his own hands, removed a cigarette, snapped the case shut, and thrust it into his trousers pocket, all, as it seemed, at a single stroke. "My dear sir," began Chauvenet, white with rage. "My dear Monsieur Chauvenet," said Armitage, striking a match, "I am indebted to you for returning a trinket that I value highly." The flame crept half the length of the stick while they regarded each other. Then Armitage raised it to the tip of his cigarette, lifted his head, and blew a cloud of smoke. "Are you able to prove your property, Mr. Armitage?" demanded Chauvenet furiously. "My dear sir, they have a saying in this country that possession is 9 points of the law. You had it. Now I have it. Wherefore it must be mine." Chauvenet's rigid figure suddenly relaxed. He leaned against a chair with a return of his habitual nonchalant air, and waved his hand carelessly. "Between gentlemen, so small a matter." "To be sure, the merest trifle," laughed Armitage, with entire good humor. "And where a gentleman has the predatory habits of a burglar and a housebreaker." "Then lesser affairs, such as picking up trinkets." "Come naturally. Quite so," said Chauvenet, and Chauvenet twisted his mustache with an air of immense satisfaction. "But the genial art of assassination, there's a business that requires a calculating hand, my dear Monsieur Chauvenet." Chauvenet's hand went again to his lip. "To be sure!" he ejaculated with zest. "But alone one can do little. For larger operations one requires, I should say, courageous associates. Now in my affairs, would you believe me, I am obliged to manage quite alone." "How melancholy!" exclaimed Chauvenet. "It is indeed very sad," and Armitage sighed, tossed his cigarette into the smoldering grate, and bade Chauvenet a ceremonious good night. "Ah, we shall meet again, I dare say." "The thought does credit to a generous nature," responded Armitage, and passed out into the house. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 9. This is America, Mr. Armitage. Lo, as I came to the crest of the hill, the sun on the heights had arisen. The dew on the grass was shining, and white was the mist on the vale. Like a lark on the wings of the dawn I sang, like a guiltless one freed from prison, as backward I gazed through the valley, and saw no one on my trail. L. Frank Tooker. Spring, planting green and gold banners on old Virginia battlefields, crossed the Potomac and occupied Washington. Shirley Claiborne called for her horse and rode forth to greet the conqueror. The afternoon was keen and sunny, and she had turned impatiently from a tea, to which she was committed, to seek the open. The call of the outdoor gods sang in her blood. Daffodils and crocuses lifted yellow flames and ruddy torches from every dooryard. She had pinned a spray of arbutus to the lapel of her tan riding-coat. It spoke to her of the blue horizons of the near Virginia hills. The young buds in the maples hovered like a mist on the tree-tops. Towering over all, the incomparable gray obelisk climbed to the blue arch and brought it nearer earth. Washington, the center of man's hope, is also, in spring, the capital of the land of heart's desire. With a groom trailing after her, Shirley rode toward Rock Creek, that rippling, murmuring, singing trifle of water that laughs day and night at the margin of the beautiful city, as though politics and statesmanship were the hugest joke in the world. The flag on the Austro-Hungarian embassy hung at half-mast, and symbols of mourning fluttered from the entire front of the house. Shirley lifted her eyes gravely as she passed. Her thoughts flew at once to the scene at the house of the Secretary of State a week before, when Baron von Marhof had learned of the death of his sovereign, and by association she thought too of Armitage, and of his look and voice as he said, "Long live the Emperor and King! God save Austria!" Emperors and kings! They were as impossible today as a snowstorm. The grave ambassadors as they appeared at great Washington functions, wearing their decorations, always struck her as being particularly distinguished. It just now occurred to her that they were all linked to the crown and scepter. But she dismissed the whole matter, and bowed to two dark ladies in a passing victoria with the quick little nod and bright smile that were the same for these tilted members of the Spanish ambassador's household as for the young daughters of a Western senator, who democratically waved their hands to her from a doorstep. Armitage came again to her mind. He had called at the Claiborne house twice since the Secretary's ball, and she had been surprised to find how fully she accepted him as an American, now that he was on her own soil. He derived, too, a certain stability from the fact that the Sandersons knew him. He was, indeed, an entirely different person since the Montana senator definitely connected him with an American landscape. She had kept her own counsel touching the scene on the deck of the King Edward, but it was not a thing lightly to be forgotten. She was half angry with herself this mellow afternoon to find how persistently Armitage came into her thoughts, and how the knife thrust on the steamer deck kept recurring in her mind and quickening her sympathy for a man of whom she knew so little. And she touched her horse impatiently with the crop and rode into the park at a gait that roused the groom to attention. At a bend of the road Chauvenet and Franzel, the attaché, swung into view, mounted, and as they met, Chauvenet turned his horse and rode beside her. "Ah, these American airs! This spring! Is it not good to be alive, Miss Claiborne?" "It is all that," she replied. It seemed to her that the day had not needed Chauvenet's praise. "I had hoped to see you later at the Wallingford tea," he continued. "No teas for me on a day like this. The thought of being indoors is tragic." She wished that he would leave her, for she had ridden out into the spring sunshine to be alone. He somehow did not appear to advantage in his riding coat. His belongings were too perfect. She had really enjoyed his talk when they had met here and there abroad, but she was in no mood for him now, and she wondered what he had lost by the transfer to America. He ran on airily in French, speaking of the rush of great and small social affairs that marked the end of the season. "Poor Franzel is indeed triste. He is taking the death of Johann Wilhelm quite hard, but here in America the death of an emperor seems less important. A king or a peasant, what does it matter?" "Better ask the robin in yonder budding chestnut tree, monsieur. This is not an hour for hard questions." "Ah, you are very cruel. You drive me back to poor, melancholy Franzel, who is indeed a funeral in himself." "That is very sad, monsieur," and she smiled at him with mischief in her eyes. "My heart goes out to anyone who is left to mourn, alone." He gathered his reins and drew up his horse, lifting his hat with a perfect gesture. "There are sadder blows than losing one's sovereign, mademoiselle." And he shook his bared head mournfully and rode back to find his friend. She sought now her favorite bridle paths, and her heart was light with the sweetness and peace of the spring as she heard the rush and splash of the creek, saw the flash of wings, and felt the mystery of awakened life throbbing about her. The heart of a girl in spring is the home of dreams, and Shirley's heart overflowed with them, until her pulse thrilled and sang in quickening cadences. The wistfulness of April, the dream of unfathomable things, shone in her brown eyes, and a girl with dreams in her eyes is the divinest work of the gods. Into this 20th century, into the iron heart of cities, she still comes, and the clear, high stars of April nights and the pensive moon of September are glad because of her. The groom marveled at the sudden changes of gait, the gallops that fell abruptly to a walk with the alterations of mood in the girl's heart, the pauses that marked a moment of meditation as she watched some green curving bank, or a plunge of the mad little creek that sent a glory of spray whitely into the sunlight. It grew late, and the shadows of waning afternoon crept through the park. The crowd had hurried home to escape the chill of the spring dusk, but she lingered on, reluctant to leave, and presently left her horse with the groom that she might walk alone beside the creek in a place that was beautifully wild. About her lay a narrow strip of young maples, and beyond this the wide park road wound at the foot of a steep wooded cliff. The place was perfectly quiet save for the splash and babble of the creek. Several minutes passed. Once she heard her groom speak to the horses, though she could not see him, but the charm of the place held her. She raised her eyes from the tumbling water before her and looked off through the maple tangle. Then she drew back quickly and clasped her riding crop tightly. Some one had paused at the farther edge of the maple brake and dismounted, as she had, for a more intimate enjoyment of the place. It was John Armitage, tapping his riding boot idly with his crop as he leaned against a tree and viewed the miniature valley. He was a little below her, so that she saw him quite distinctly, and caught a glimpse of his horse pawing with arched neck in the bridle path behind him. She had no wish to meet him there, and turned to steal back to her horse, when a movement in the maples below caught her eye. She paused, fascinated and alarmed by the cautious stir of the undergrowth. The air was perfectly quiet. The disturbance was not caused by the wind. Then the head and shoulders of a man were disclosed, as he crouched on hands and knees, watching Armitage. His small head and big body as he crept forward suggested to Shirley some fantastic monster of legend, and her heart beat fast with terror as a knife flashed in his hand. He moved more rapidly toward the silent figure by the tree, and still Shirley watched with wide eyes, her figure tense and trembling, the hand that held the crop half raised to her lips, while the dark form rose and poised for a spring. Then she cried out, her voice ringing clear and high across the little vale and sounding back from the cliff. "Oh, oh!" And Armitage leaped forward and turned. His crop fell first upon the raised hand, knocking the knife far into the trees, and then upon the face and shoulders of the Servian. The fellow turned and fled through the maple tangle, Armitage after him, and Shirley ran back toward the bridge where she had left her groom and met him halfway hurrying toward her. "What is it, miss? Did you call?" "No, it was nothing, Thomas, nothing at all," and she mounted and turned toward home. Her heart was still pounding with excitement as she walked her horse to gain composure. Twice, in circumstances most unusual and disquieting, she had witnessed an attack on John Armitage by an unknown enemy. She recalled now a certain pathos of his figure as she first saw him, leaning against the tree, watching the turbulent little stream, and she was impatient to find how her sympathy went out to him. It made no difference who John Armitage was. His enemy was a coward, and the horror of such a menace to a man's life appalled her. She passed a mounted policeman, who recognized her and raised his hand in salute, but the idea of reporting the strange affair in the strip of woodland occurred to her only to be dismissed. She felt that here was an ugly business that was not within the grasp of a park patrolman, and, moreover, John Armitage was entitled to pursue his own course in matters that touched his life so closely. The thought of him reassured her. He was no simple boy to suffer such attacks to pass unchallenged, and so, dismissing him, she raised her head and saw him gallop forth from a by-path and rein his horse beside her. "Miss Claiborne." The suppressed feeling in his tone made the moment tense, and she saw that his lips trembled. It was a situation that must have its quick relief, so she said instantly, in a mockery of his own tone, "Mr. Armitage!" She laughed. "I am almost caught in the dark. The blandishments of spring have beguiled me." He looked at her with a quick scrutiny. It did not seem possible that this could be the girl who had called to him in warning scarce 5 minutes before. But he knew it had been she. He would have known her voice anywhere in the world. They rode silent beside the creek, which was like a laughing companion seeking to mock them into a cheerier mood. At an opening through the hills they saw the western horizon aglow in tints of lemon deepening into gold and purple. Save for the riot of the brook, the world was at peace. She met his eyes for an instant, and their gravity, and the firm lines in which his lips were set, showed that the shock of his encounter had not yet passed. "You must think me a strange person, Miss Claiborne. It seems inexplicable that a man's life should be so menaced in a place like this. If you had not called to me—" "Please don't speak of that. It was so terrible." "But I must speak of it. Once before the same attempt was made, that night on the King Edward." "Yes, I have not forgotten." "And today I have reason to believe that the same man watched for his chance, for I have ridden here every day since I came, and he must have kept track of me." "But this is America, Mr. Armitage." "That does not help me with you. You have every reason to resent my bringing you into such dangers. It is unpardonable, indefensible." She saw that he was greatly troubled. "But you couldn't help my being in the park today. I have often stopped just there before. It is a favorite place for meditations. If you know the man—" "I know the man." "Then the law will certainly protect you, as you know very well. He was a dreadful-looking person. The police can undoubtedly find and lock him up." She was seeking to minimize the matter, to pass it off as a commonplace affair of every day. They were walking their horses. The groom followed stolidly behind. Armitage was silent, a look of great perplexity on his face. When he spoke he was quite calm. "Miss Claiborne, I must tell you that this is an affair in which I can't ask help in the usual channels. You will pardon me if I seem to make a mystery of what should be ordinarily a bit of business between myself and the police. But to give publicity to these attempts to injure me just now would be a mistake. I could have caught the man there in the wood, but I let him go, for the reason that I want the men back of him to show themselves before I act. But if it isn't presuming—" He was quite himself again. His voice was steady and deep, with the ease and assurance that she liked in him. She had marked today, in his earnestness, more than at any other time, a slight, an almost indistinguishable trace of another tongue in his English. "How am I to know whether it would be presuming?" she asked. But I was going to say, when rudely interrupted. She was trying to make it easy for him to say whatever he wished. "That these troubles of mine are really personal. I have committed no crime, and I am not fleeing from justice." She laughed and urged her horse into a gallop for a last stretch of road near the park limits. "How uninteresting! We expect a Montana ranchman to have a spectacular past." "But not to carry it, I hope, to Washington. On the range I might become a lawless bandit in the interest of picturesqueness, but here—" "Here in the world of frock-coated statesmen, nothing really interesting is to be expected." She walked her horse again. It occurred to her that he might wish an assurance of silence from her. What she had seen would make a capital bit of gossip, to say nothing of being material for the newspapers, and her conscience, she reflected, grew uneasy at the thought of shielding him. She knew that her father and mother, and, even more strictly, her brother, would close the doors on a man whose enemies followed him overseas and lay in wait for him in a peaceful park. But here she tested him. A man of breeding would not ask protection of a woman on whom he had no claim, and it was certainly not for her to establish an understanding with him in so strange and grave a matter. "It must be fun, having a ranch with cattle on 1,000 hills. I always wished my father would go in for a Western place, but he can't travel so far from home. Our ranch is in Virginia." "You have a Virginia farm? That's very interesting." "Yes, at Storm Springs. It's really beautiful down there," she said simply. It was on his tongue to tell her that he, too, owned a bit of Virginia soil, but he had just established himself as a Montana ranchman, and it seemed best not to multiply his places of residence. He had, moreover, forgotten the name of the country in which his preserve lay. He said with truth, "I know nothing of Virginia or the South, but I have viewed the landscape from Arlington, and some day I hope to go adventuring in the Virginia hills." Then you should not overlook our valley. I'm sure there must be adventures waiting for somebody down there. You can tell our place by the spring lamb on the hillside. There's a huge inn that offers the long-distance telephone and market reports and golf links and very good horses, and lots of people stop there as a matter of course in their flight between Florida and Newport. They go up and down the coast like the mercury in a thermometer, up when it's warm, down when it's cold. There's the secret of our mercurial temperament." A passing automobile frightened her horse, and he watched her perfect coolness in quieting the animal with rein and voice. "He's just up from the farm, and doesn't like town very much. But he shall go home again soon," she said as they rode on. "Oh, you go down to shepherd those spring lambs!" he exclaimed, with misgiving in his heart. He had followed her across the sea, and now she was about to take flight again. "Yes, and to escape from the tiresome business of trying to remember people's names." "Then you reverse the usual fashionable process. You go south to meet the rising mercury." "I hadn't thought of it, but that is so. I dearly love a hillside, with pines and cedars, and sloping meadows with sheep, and rides over mountain roads to the Gate of Dreams, where Spotswood's golden horseshoe knights ride out at you with a grand sweep of their plumed hats. Now what have you to say to that?" "Nothing but my entire approval," he said. He dimly understood, as he left her in this gay mood, at the Claiborne house, that she had sought to make him forget the lurking figure in the park thicket and the dark deed thwarted there. It was her way of conveying to him her dismissal of the incident, and it implied a greater kindness than any pledge of secrecy. He rode away with grave eyes, and a new hope filled his heart. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 10. John Armitage is Shadowed. Afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me leading wherever I choose. Walt Whitman. Armitage dined alone that evening, and left the hotel at 9 o'clock for a walk. He unaffectedly enjoyed paved ground and the sights and ways of cities, and he walked aimlessly about the lighted thoroughfares of the capital with conscious pleasure in the movement and color of life. He let his eyes follow the Washington Monument's gray lines starward, and he stopped to enjoy the high-poised equestrian statue of Sherman, to which the starry dusk gave something of legendary and old-world charm. Coming out upon Pennsylvania Avenue, he strolled past the White House, and, at the wide-flung gates, paused while a carriage swept by him at the driveway. He saw within the grim face of Baron von Marhof, and unconsciously lifted his hat, though the ambassador was deep in thought and did not see him. Armitage struck the pavement smartly with his stick as he walked slowly on, pondering. But he was conscious a moment later that someone was loitering persistently in his wake. Armitage was at once on the alert, with all his faculties sharpened. He turned and gradually slackened his pace, and the person behind him immediately did likewise. The sensation of being followed is at first annoying. Then a pleasant zest creeps into it, and in Armitage's case the reaction was immediate. He was even amused to reflect that the shadow had chosen for his exploit what is probably the most conspicuous and best guarded spot in America. It was not yet 10 o'clock, but the streets were comparatively free of people. He slackened his pace gradually, and threw open his overcoat, for the night was warm, to give an impression of ease, and when he had reached the somber facade of the Treasury Building, he paused and studied it in the glare of the electric lights, as though he were a chance traveler taking a preliminary view of the sights of the Capitol. A man still lingered behind him, drawing nearer now, at a moment when they had the sidewalk comparatively free to themselves. The fellow was short, but of soldierly erectness, and even in his loitering pace lifted his feet with the quick precision of the drilled man. Armitage walked to the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and 15th Street, then turned and retraced his steps slowly past the Treasury Building. The man who had been following faced about and walked slowly in the opposite direction, and Armitage, quickening his own pace, amused himself by dogging the fellow's steps closely for 20 yards, then passed him. When he had gained the advantage of a few feet, Armitage stopped suddenly and spoke to the man in the casual tone he might have used in addressing a passing acquaintance. "My friend," he said, "there are 2 policemen across the street. If you continue to follow me I shall call their attention to you." "Pardon me." "You are watching me, and the thing won't do." "Yes, I'm watching you, but—" "The thing won't do. If you are hired—" "Nein, nein, you do me wrong, sir." "Then if you are not hired you are your own master, and you serve yourself ill when you take the trouble to follow me. Now I'm going to finish my walk, and I beg you to keep out of my way. This is not a place where liberties may be infringed with impunity. Good evening, sir." Armitage wheeled about sharply, and as his face came into the full light of the street lamps, the stranger stared at him intently. Armitage was fumbling in his pocket for a coin, but this impertinence caused him to change his mind. 2 policemen were walking slowly toward them, and Armitage, annoyed by the whole incident, walked quickly away. He was not wholly at ease over the meeting. The fact that Chauvenet had so promptly put a spy as well as the Servian assassin on his trail quickened his pulse with anger for an instant, and then sobered him. He continued his walk, and paused presently before an array of books in a shop window. Then some one stopped at his side, and he looked up to find the same man he had accosted at the Treasury Building lifting his hat, an American soldier's campaign hat. The fellow was an extreme blonde, with a smooth-shaven, weather-beaten face, blue eyes, and light hair. "Pardon me, you are mistaken. I am not a spy. But it is wonderful. It is quite wonderful." The man's face was alight with discovery, with an alert pleasure that awaited recognition. "My dear fellow, you really become annoying," and Armitage again thrust his hand into his trouser pocket. "I should hate awfully to appeal to the police, but you must not crowd me too far." The man seemed moved by deep feeling, and his eyes were bright with excitement. His hands clasped tightly the railing that protected the glass window of the bookshop. As Armitage turned away impatiently, the man ejaculated huskily, as though some overmastering influence wrung the words from him. "Don't you know me? I am Oscar. Don't you remember me, and the great forest, where I taught you to shoot and fish? You are—" He bent toward Armitage with a fierce insistence, his eyes blazing in his eagerness to be understood. John Armitage turned again to the window, leaned lightly upon the iron railing, and studied the title of a book attentively. He was silently absorbed for a full minute, in which the man who followed him waited. Taking his cue from Armitage's manner, he appeared to be deeply interested in the bookseller's display, but the excitement still glittered in his eyes. Armitage was thinking swiftly, and his thoughts covered a very wide range of time and place as he stood there. Then he spoke very deliberately and coolly, but with a certain peremptory sharpness. "Go ahead of me to the New American and wait in the office until I come." The man's hand went to his hat. "None of that!" Armitage arrested him with a gesture. "My name is Armitage, John Armitage," he said, "and I advise you to remember it. Now go." The man hurried away, and Armitage slowly followed. It occurred to him that the man might be of use, and with this in mind he returned to the New American, got his key from the office, nodded to his acquaintance of the street, and led the way to the elevator. Armitage put aside his coat and hat, locked the hall door, and then, when the two stood face to face in his little sitting room, he surveyed the man carefully. "What do you want?" he demanded bluntly. He took a cigarette from a box on the table, lighted it, and then, with an air of finality, fixed his gaze upon the man, who eyed him with a kind of stupefied wonder. Then there flashed into the fellow's bronzed face something of dignity and resentment. He stood perfectly erect with his felt hat clasped in his hand. His clothes were cheap, but clean, and his short coat was buttoned trimly about him. "I want nothing, Mr. Armitage," he replied humbly, speaking slowly and with a marked German accent. "Then you will be easily satisfied," said Armitage. "You said your name was—" "Oscar Breunig." Armitage sat down and scrutinized the man again without relaxing his severity. "You think you have seen me somewhere, so you have followed me in the streets to make sure. When did this idea first occur to you?" "I saw you at Fort Myer at the drill last Friday. I have been looking for you since, and saw you leave your horse at the hotel this afternoon. You ride at Rock Creek, yes?" "What do you do for a living, Mr. Breunig?" asked Armitage. "I was in the army, but served out my time, and was discharged a few months ago, and came to Washington to see where they make the government, yes? I am going to South America. Is it Peru, yes? There will be a revolution." He paused, and Armitage met his eyes. They were very blue and kind, eyes that spoke of sincerity and fidelity, such eyes as a leader of forlorn hopes would like to know were behind him when he gave the order to charge. Then a curious thing happened. It may have been the contact of eye with eye that awoke question and response between them. It may have been a need in one that touched a chord of helplessness in the other. But suddenly Armitage leaped to his feet and grasped the outstretched hands of the little soldier. "Oscar," he said, and repeated very softly, "Oscar." The man was deeply moved, and the tears sprang into his eyes. Armitage laughed, holding him at arm's length. "None of that nonsense. Sit down." He turned to the door, opened it, and peered into the hall, locked the door again, then motioned the man to a chair. "So you deserted your mother country, did you, and have borne arms for the glorious Republic?" "I served in the Philippines, yes." "Rank, titles, emoluments, Oscar?" "I was a sergeant, and the surgeon could not find the bullet after Big Bend, Luzon. So they were sorry and gave me a certificate and $2 a month to my pay," said the man, so succinctly and colorlessly that Armitage laughed. "You have done well, Oscar. Honor me by accepting a cigar." The man took a cigar from the box which Armitage extended, but would not light it. He held it rather absent-mindedly in his hand, and continued to stare. "You are not dead, Mr. Armitage. But your father—" "My father is dead, Oscar." "He was a good man," said the soldier. "Yes, he was a good man," repeated Armitage gravely. "I am alive, and yet I am dead, Oscar. Do you grasp the idea? You were a good friend when we were lads together in the great forest. If I should want you to help me now—" The man jumped to his feet and stood at attention so gravely that Armitage laughed and slapped his knee. "You are well taught, Sergeant Oscar. Sit down. I am going to trust you. My affairs just now are not without their trifling dangers." "There are enemies, yes?" And Oscar nodded his head solemnly in acceptance of the situation. "I am going to trust you absolutely. You have no confidants. You are not married." "How should a man be married who is a soldier? I have no friends. They are unprofitable," declared Oscar solemnly. "I fear you are a pessimist, Oscar, but a pessimist who keeps his mouth shut is a good ally. Now, if you are not afraid of being shot or stuck with a knife, and if you are willing to obey my orders for a few weeks, we may be able to do some business. First, remember that I am Mr. Armitage. You must learn that now, and remember it for all time. If anyone should ever suggest anything else—" The man nodded his comprehension. "That will be the time for Oscar to be dumb. I understand, Mr. Armitage." Armitage smiled. The man presented so vigorous a picture of health, his simple character was so transparently reflected in his eyes and face, that he did not in the least question him. "You are an intelligent person, Sergeant. If you are equally discreet, able to be deaf when troublesome questions are asked, then I think we shall get on." "You should remember—" began Oscar. "I remember nothing," observed Armitage sharply, and Oscar was quite humble again. Armitage opened a trunk and took out an envelope from which he drew several papers and a small map, which he unfolded and spread on the table. He marked a spot with his lead pencil and passed the map to Oscar. "Do you think you could find that place?" The man breathed hard over it for several minutes. "Yes, it would be easy," and he nodded his head several times as he named the railroad stations nearest the point indicated by Armitage. The place was in one of the mountainous counties of Virginia, 15 miles from an east and west railway line. Armitage opened a duly recorded deed, which conveyed to himself the title to 2,000 acres of land, also a curiously complicated abstract of title, showing the successive transfers of ownership from colonial days down through the years of Virginia's splendor to the dread time when battle shook the world. The title had passed from the receiver of a defunct shooting club to Armitage, who had been charmed by the description of the property as set forth in an advertisement, and lured, moreover, by the amazingly small price at which the preserve was offered. "It is a farm, yes?" "It is a wilderness, I fancy," said Armitage. "I have never seen it. I may never see it, for that matter. But you will find your way there, going first to this town, Lamar, studying the country, keeping your mouth shut, and seeing what improvements on the ground amount to. There's some sort of a bungalow there, built by the shooting club. Here's a description of the place, on the strength of which I bought it. You may take these papers along to judge the size of the swindle." "Yes, sir." "And a couple of good horses, plenty of commissary stores, plain military necessities, you understand, and some bedding should be provided. I want you to take full charge of this matter and get to work as quickly as possible. It may be a trifle lonesome down there among the hills, but if you serve me well you shall not regret it." "Yes, I'm quite satisfied with the job," said Oscar. "And after you have reached the place and settled yourself, you will tell the postmaster and telegraph operator who you are and where you may be found, so that messages may reach you promptly. If you get an unsigned message advising you of, let me consider, a shipment of steers, you may expect me any hour. On the other hand, you may not see me at all. We'll consider that our agreement lasts until the first snow flies next winter. You are a soldier?" The man nodded gravely. "And it is well for you not to reappear in this hotel. If you should be questioned on leaving here—" "I have not been here, is it not?" "It is," replied Armitage, smiling. "You read and write English?" "Yes, one must to serve in the army." "If you should see a big Servian with a neck like a bull and a head the size of a pea, who speaks very bad German, you will do well to keep out of his way, unless you find a good place to tie him up. I advise you not to commit murder without special orders. Do you understand?" "It is the custom of the country," assented Oscar, in a tone of deep regret. "To be sure," laughed Armitage. "And now I am going to give you money enough to carry out the project I have indicated." He took from his trunk a long bill book, counted out 20 new $100 bills, and threw them on the table. "It is much money," observed Oscar, counting the bills laboriously. "It will be enough for your purposes. You can't spend much money up there if you try. Bacon, perhaps eggs, a cow may be necessary. Who can tell without trying it? Don't write me any letters or telegrams, and forget that you have seen me if you don't hear from me again." He went to the elevator and rode down to the office with Oscar and dismissed him carelessly. Then John Armitage brought an armful of magazines and newspapers and returned to his room, quite like any other traveler, taking the comforts of his inn. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 11. The Toss of a Napkin. As music and splendor survive not the lamp and the lute, the heart's echoes render no song when the spirit is mute. No song, but sad dirges, like the wind through a ruined cell, or the mournful surges that ring the dead seaman's knell. Shelley. Captain Richard Claiborne gave a supper at the Army and Navy Club for 10 men in honor of the newly arrived military attaché of the Spanish legation. He had drawn his guests largely from his foreign acquaintances in Washington because the Spaniards spoke little English. And Dick knew Washington well enough to understand that while a girl and a man who speak different languages may sit comfortably together at table, men in like predicament grow morose and are likely to quarrel with their eyes before the cigars are passed. It was Friday, and the whole party had witnessed the drill at Fort Myer that afternoon, with 9 girls to listen to their explanation of the maneuvers, and the earliest spring bride for chaperone. Shirley had been of the party, and somewhat the heroine of it, too, for it was Dick who sat on his horse out in the tan bark with a little whistle to his lips and manipulated the troop.
Here's a confusion of tongues. I may need you to interpret," laughed Dick, indicating the chair at his left, and when Armitage sat down he faced Chauvenet across the round table. With the first filling of glasses it was found that everyone could speak French, and the talk went forward spiritedly. The discussion of military matters naturally occupied first place, and all were anxious to steer clear of anything that might be offensive to the Spaniard who had lost a brother at San Juan. Claiborne thought it wisest to discuss nations that were not represented at the table, and this made it very simple for all to unite in rejecting the impertinent claims of Japan to be reckoned among the world powers, and to declare, for the benefit of the Russian attaché, that Slav and Saxon must ultimately contend for earth's dominion. Then they fell to talking about individuals, chiefly men in the public eye, and as the Austro-Hungarian embassy was in mourning and unrepresented at the table, the new Emperor-King was discussed with considerable frankness. "He has not old Stroebel's right hand to hold him up," remarked a young German officer. "Thereby hangs a dark tale," remarked Claiborne. "Somebody stuck a knife into Count von Stroebel at a singular inopportune moment. I saw him in Geneva 2 days before he was assassinated, and he was very feeble and seemed harassed. It gives a man the shudders to think of what might happen if His Majesty, Charles Louis, should go by the board. His only child died a year ago. After him his cousin Francis, and then the deluge." "Bah! Francis is not as dark as he's painted. He is the most lied-about prince in Europe," remarked Chauvenet. "He would most certainly be an improvement on Charles Louis. But alas, Charles Louis will undoubtedly live on forever, like his lamented father. The king is dead. Long live the king!" "Nothing can happen," remarked the German sadly. "I have lost much money betting on upheavals in that direction. If there were a man in Hungary it would be different, but riots are not revolutions." "That is quite true," said Armitage quietly. "But," observed the Spaniard, "if Archduke Karl had not gone out of his head and died 2 or 3 dozen places, so that no one is sure he is dead at all, things at Vienna might be rather more interesting. Karl took a son with him into exile. Suppose one or the other of them should reappear, stir up strife, and incite rebellion." "Such speculations are quite idle," commented Chauvenet. "There is no doubt whatever that Karl is dead, or we should hear of him." "Of course," said the German. "If he were not, the death of the old Emperor would have brought him to life again." "The same applies to the boy he carried away with him. Undoubtedly dead, or we should hear of him. Karl disappeared soon after his son Francis was born. It was said—" "A pretty tale it is," commented the German, "that the child wasn't exactly Karl's own. He took it quite hard, went away to hide his shame in exile, taking his son Frederick Augustus with him." "He was surely mad," remarked Chauvenet, sipping a cordial. "He is much better dead and out of the way for the good of Austria. Francis, as I say, is a good fellow. We have hunted together, and I know him well." They fell into talking about the lost sons of royal houses, and a good number there have been, even in these later centuries, and then of the latest marriages between American women and titled foreigners. Chauvenet was now leading the conversation. It might even have seemed to a critical listener that he was guiding it with a certain intention. He laughed as though at the remembrance of something amusing, and held the little company while he bent over a candle to light a cigar. "With all due respect to our American host, I must say that a title in America goes further than anywhere else in the world. I was at Bar Harbor 3 years ago when the Baron von Kissel devastated that region. He made sad havoc among the ladies that summer. The rest of us simply had no place to stand. You remember, gentlemen," Chauvenet looked slowly around the listening circle, "that the unexpected arrival of the excellent ambassador of Austria-Hungary caused the Baron to leave Bar Harbor between dark and daylight. The story was that he got off in a sailboat, and the next we heard of him he was masquerading under some title in San Francisco, where he proved to be a dangerous forger. You all remember that the papers were full of his performances for a while, but he was a lucky rascal, and always disappeared at the proper psychological moment. He had, as you may say, the cosmopolitan accent, and was the most plausible fellow alive." Chauvenet held his audience well in hand, for nearly everyone remembered the brilliant exploits of the fraudulent Baron, and all were interested in what promised to be some new information about him. Armitage, listening intently to Chauvenet's recital, felt his blood quicken, and his face flushed for a moment. His cigarette case lay upon the edge of the table,
and he snapped it shut and fingered it nervously as he listened. "It is my experience," continued Chauvenet, "that we never meet a person only once. There's always a second meeting somewhere, and I was not at all surprised when I ran upon my old friend the Baron in Germany last fall." "At his old tricks, I suppose," observed some one. "No, that was the strangest part of it. He's struck a deeper game, though I'm blessed if I can make it out. He dropped the title altogether, and now calls himself Mr. I've forgotten for the moment the rest of it, but it is an English name. He's made a stake somehow, and travels in decent comfort. He passes now as an American. His English is excellent, and he hints at large American interests." "He probably has forged securities to sell," commented the German. "I know those fellows. The business is best done quietly." "I dare say," returned Chauvenet. "Of course you greeted him as a long-lost friend," remarked Claiborne leadingly. "No, I wanted to make sure of him, and strangely enough he assisted me in a very curious way." All felt that they were now to hear the denouement of the story, and several men bent forward in their absorption with their elbows on the table. Chauvenet smiled and resumed, with a little shrug of his shoulders. "Well, I must go back a moment to say that the man I knew at Bar Harbor had a real crest. The ladies to whom he wrote notes treasured them, I dare say, because of the pretty insignium. He had it engraved on his cigarette case, a bird of some kind tiptoeing on a helmet, and beneath it there was a motto, Fide non armis." "The devil!" exclaimed the young German. "Why, that's very like the device of the Austrian Schombergs. Well, I remember the cigarette case, and one night at a concert, in Berlin, you know, I chanced to sit with some friends at a table quite near where he sat alone. I had my eye on him, trying to assure myself of his identity, when, in closing his cigarette case, it fell almost at my feet, and I bumped heads with a waiter as I picked it up. I wanted to make sure, and handed it to him, the imitation Baron." "That was your chance to startle him a trifle, I should say," remarked the German. "He was the man, beyond doubt. There was no mistaking the cigarette case. What I said was," continued Chauvenet, "Allow me, Baron." "Well spoken!" exclaimed the Spanish officer. "Not so well either," laughed Chauvenet. "He had the best of it. He's a clever man, I'm obliged to admit. He said," and Chauvenet's mirth stifled him for a moment. "Yes? What was it?" demanded the German impatiently. "He said, 'Thank you, waiter,' and put the cigarette case back into his pocket." They all laughed. Then Captain Claiborne's eyes fell upon the table and rested idly upon John Armitage's cigarette case, on the smoothly worn gold of the surface, on the snowy falcon, and on the silver helmet on which the bird poised. He started slightly, then tossed his napkin carelessly on the table so that it covered the gold trinket completely. "Gentlemen," he said, "if we are going to show ourselves at the Darlington ball, we'll have to run along." Below, in the coach room, Claiborne was fastening the frogs of his military overcoat when Armitage, who had waited for the opportunity, spoke to him. "That story is a lie, Claiborne. The man never saw me or my cigarette case in Berlin, and moreover, I was never at Bar Harbor in my life. I gave you some account of myself on the King Edward. Every word of it is true." "You should face him. You must have it out with him," exclaimed Claiborne, and Armitage saw the conflict and uncertainty in the officer's eyes. "But the time hasn't come for that." "Then if there is something between you," began Claiborne, the doubt now clearly dominant. "There is undoubtedly a great deal between us, and there will be more before we reach the end." Dick Claiborne was a perfectly frank, outspoken fellow, and this hint of mystery by a man whose character had just been boldly assailed angered him. "Good God, man! I know as much about Chauvenet as I do about you. This thing is ugly, as you must see. I don't like it, I tell you. You've got to do more than deny a circumstantial story like that by a fellow whose standing here is as good as yours. If you don't offer some better explanation of this by tomorrow night, I shall have to ask you to cut my acquaintance, and the acquaintance of my family." Armitage's face was grave, but he smiled as he took his hat and stick. "I shall not be able to satisfy you of my respectability by tomorrow night, Captain Claiborne. My own affairs must wait on larger matters." "Then you need never take the trouble." "In my own time you shall be quite fully satisfied," said Armitage quietly, and turned away. He was not among the others of the Claiborne party when they got into their carriages to go to the ball. He went, in fact, to the telegraph office and sent a message to Oscar Breunig, Lamar, Virginia, giving notice of a shipment of steers. Then he returned to the New American and packed his belongings. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 12. A Camp in the Mountains. Who climbed the blue Virginia hills against embattled foes, and planted there, in valleys fair, the lily and the rose, whose fragrance lives in many lands, whose beauty stars the earth, and lights the hearths of happy homes with loveliness and worth. Francis O. Ticknor. The study of maps and timetables is a far more profitable business than appears. John Armitage possessed a great store of geographical knowledge as interpreted in such literature. He could tell you, without leaving his room, and probably without opening his trunk, the quickest way out of Tokyo, or St. Petersburg, or Calcutta, or Cinch Tight, Montana, if you suddenly received a cablegram calling you to Vienna, or Paris, or Washington from one of those places. Such being the case, it was remarkable that he should have started for a point in the Virginia hills by way of Boston, thence to Norfolk by coastwise steamer, and on to Lamar by lines of railroad whose schedules would have been the despair of unhardened travelers. He had expressed his trunks direct, and traveled with 2 suitcases and an umbrella. His journey, since his boat swung out into Massachusetts Bay, had been spent in gloomy speculations, and 2 young women booked for Baltimore wrongly attributed his reticence and aloofness to a grievous disappointment in love. He had wanted time to think, to ponder his affairs, to devise some way out of his difficulties, and to contrive the defeat of Chauvenet. Moreover, his relations to the Claibornes were in an ugly tangle. Chauvenet had dealt him a telling blow in a quarter where he particularly wished to appear to advantage. He jumped out of the day coach in which he had accomplished the last stage of his journey to Lamar, just at dawn, and found Oscar with 2 horses waiting. "Good morning," said Oscar, saluting. "You are prompt, Sergeant," and Armitage shook hands with him. As the train rolled on through the valley, Armitage opened one of the suitcases and took out a pair of leather leggings, which he strapped on. Then Oscar tied the cases together with a rope and hung them across his saddle-bow. "The place, what of it?" asked Armitage. "There may be worse. I have not decided." Armitage laughed aloud. "Is it as bad as that?" The man was busy tightening the saddle girths, and he answered Armitage's further questions with soldier-like brevity. "You have been here 2 weeks, sir. And nothing has happened. It is a good report." "It is good for the soul to stand on mountains and look at the world. You will like that animal, yes? He is lighter than a cavalry horse. Mine, you will notice, is a trifle heavier. I bought them at a stock farm in another valley, and rode them up to the place." The train sent back loud echoes. A girl in a pink sunbonnet rode up on a mule and carried off the mail pouch. The station agent was busy inside at his telegraph instruments and paid no heed to the horsemen. Save for a few huts clustered on the hillside, there were no signs of human habitation in sight. The lights in a switch target showed yellow against the growing dawn. "I'm quite ready, sir," reported Oscar, touching his hat. "There is nothing here but the station. The settlement is farther on our way." "Then let us be off," said Armitage, swinging into the saddle. Oscar led the way in silence along a narrow road that clung close to the base of a great pine-covered hill. The morning was sharp, and the horses stepped smartly, the breath of their nostrils showing white on the air. The far roar and whistle of the train came back more and more faintly, and when it had ceased Armitage sighed, pushed his soft felt hat from his face, and settled himself more firmly in his saddle. The keen air was as stimulating as wine, and he put his horse to the gallop and rode ahead to shake up his blood. "It is good," said the solid cavalryman, as Armitage wheeled again in line with him. "Yes, it is good," repeated Armitage. A peace descended upon him that he had not known in many days. The light grew as the sun rose higher, blazing upon them like a brazen target through the deep clefts in the mountains. The morning mists retreated before them to farther ridges and peaks, and the beautiful gray blue of the Virginia hills delighted Armitage's eyes. The region was very wild. Here and there from some mountaineer's cabin a light penciling of smoke stole upwards. They once passed a boy driving a yoke of steers. After several miles the road, that had hung midway of the rough hill, dipped down sharply, and they came out into another and broader valley, where there were tilled farms and a little settlement, with a blacksmith shop and a country store, post office and inn combined. The storekeeper stood in the door, smoking a cob pipe. Seeing Oscar, he went inside and brought out some letters and newspapers, which he delivered in silence. "This is Lamar post office," announced Oscar. "There must be some mail here for me," said Armitage. Oscar handed him several long envelopes. They bore the name of the Bronx Loan and Trust Company, whose office in New York was his permanent address, and he opened and read a number of letters and cablegrams that had been forwarded. Their contents evidently gave him satisfaction, for he whistled cheerfully as he thrust them into his pocket. "You keep in touch with the world, do you, Oscar? It's commendable." "I take a Washington paper. It relieves the monotony, and I can see where the regiments are moving, and whether my old captain is yet out of the hospital, and what happened to my lieutenant in his court-martial about the pay accounts. One must observe the world, yes? At the post office back there," he jerked his head to indicate, "it is against the law to sell whiskey in a post office, so that storekeeper with the red nose and small yellow eyes keeps it in a brown jug in the back room." "To be sure," laughed Armitage. "I hope it is a good article." "It is vile," replied Oscar. "His brother makes it up in the hills, and it is as strong as woodlye." "Moonshine! I have heard of it. We must have some for rainy days." It was a new world to John Armitage, and his heart was as light as the morning air as he followed Oscar along the ruddy mountain road. He was in Virginia, and somewhere on this soil, perhaps in some valley like the one through which he rode, Shirley Claiborne had gazed upon blue distances, with ridge rising against ridge, and dark pine-covered slopes like these he saw for the first time. He had left his affairs in Washington in a sorry muddle, but he faced the new day with a buoyant spirit, and did not trouble himself to look very far ahead. He had a definite business before him. His cablegrams were reassuring on that point. The fact that he was, in a sense, a fugitive, did not trouble him in the least. He had no intention of allowing Jules Chauvenet's assassins to kill him, or of being locked up in a Washington jail as the false Baron von Kissel. If he admitted that he was not John Armitage, it would be difficult to prove that he was anybody else, a fact touching human testimony which Jules Chauvenet probably knew perfectly well. On the whole he was satisfied that he had followed the wisest course thus far. The broad panorama of the morning hills communicated to his spirit a growing elation. He began singing in German a ballad that recited the sorrows of a pale maiden prisoner in a dark tower on the Rhine, whence her true knight rescued her, after many and fearsome adventures. On the last stave he ceased abruptly, and an exclamation of wonder broke from him. They had been riding along a narrow trail that afforded, as Oscar said, a short cut across the long timbered ridge that lay between them and Armitage's property. The path was rough and steep, and the low-hanging pine boughs and heavy underbrush increased the difficulties of ascent. Straining to the top, a new valley, hidden until now, was disclosed in the long and beautiful vistas. Armitage dropped his reins upon the neck of his panting horse. "It is a fine valley, yes?" asked Oscar. "It is a possession worthy of the noblest gods," replied Armitage. "There is a white building with colonnades away over there. Is that the house of the reigning deity?" "It is not, sir," answered Oscar, who spoke English with a kind of dogged precision, giving equal value to all words. "It is a vast hotel, where the rich spend much money. That place at the foot of the hills. Do you see? It is there they play the foolish game with sticks and little balls." "Golf? Is it possible?" "There is no doubt of it, sir. I have seen the fools myself, men and women. The place is called Storm Valley." Armitage slapped his thigh sharply, so that his horse started. "Yes, you are probably right, Oscar. I have heard of the place, and those houses that lie beyond there in the valley belong to the gentlemen of taste and leisure, who drink the waters and ride horses and play the foolish game you describe with the little white balls." "I could tell it no better," responded Oscar, who had dismounted, like a good trooper, to rest his horse. "And our place, is it below there?" demanded Armitage. "It is not, sir. It lies to the west. But a man may come here when he is lonesome and look at the people and the gentlemen's houses. At night it is a pleasure to see the lights, and sometimes, when the wind is right, there is music of bands." "Poor Oscar!" laughed Armitage. His mood had not often in his life been so high. On his flight northward from Washington and southward down the Atlantic capes, the thought that Shirley Claiborne and her family must now believe him an ignoble scoundrel had wrought misgivings and pain in his heart. But at least he would soon be near her. Even now she might be somewhere below in the lovely valley. And he drew off his hat and stared down upon what was glorified and enchanted ground. "Let us go," he said presently. Oscar saluted, standing bridle in hand. "You will find it easier to walk," he said, and, leading their horses, they retraced their steps for several hundred yards along the ridge, then mounted and proceeded slowly down again until they came to a mountain road. Presently a high wire fence followed at their right, where the descent was sharply arrested, and they came to a barred wooden gate, and beside it a small cabin, evidently designed for a lodge. "This is the place, sir," and Oscar dismounted and threw open the gate. The road within followed the rough contour of the hillside that still turned downward until it broadened into a wooded plateau. The flutter of wings in the underbrush, the scamper of squirrels, the mad lope of a fox, kept the eye busy. A deer broke out of a hazel thicket, started at the horsemen in wide-eyed amazement, then plunged into the wood and disappeared. "There are deer, and of foxes a great plenty," remarked Oscar. He turned toward Armitage and added with a lowered voice, "It is different from our old hills and forests, yes, but sometimes I have been homesick." "But this is not so bad, Oscar, and some day you shall go back." "Here," said the soldier, as they swung out of the wood and into the open, "is what they call the port of missing men." There was a broad park-like area that tended downward almost imperceptibly to a deep defile. They dismounted and walked to the edge and looked down the steep sides. A little creek flowed out of the wood and emptied itself with a silvery rush into the vale, caught its breath below, and became a creek again. A slight suspension bridge flung across the defile had once afforded a short cut to Storm Springs, but it was now in disrepair, and at either end was posted "No thoroughfare." Armitage stepped upon the loose planking and felt the frail thing vibrate under his weight. "It is a bad place," remarked Oscar, as the bridge creaked and swung, and Armitage laughed and jumped back to solid ground. The surface of this harbor of hills was rough with outcropping rock. In some great stress of nature the trees had been destroyed utterly, and only a scant growth of weeds and wildflowers remained. The place suggested a battleground for the winds, where they might meet and struggle in wild combat, or, more practically, it was large enough for the evolutions of a squadron of cavalry. "Why the name?" asked Armitage. "There were gray soldiers of many battles, yes, who fought the long fight against the blue soldiers in the Valley of Virginia, and after the war was over, some of them would not surrender. No, but they marched here, and stayed a long time, and kept their last flag. And so the place is called the Port of Missing Men. They built that stone wall over there, beyond the patch of cedars, and camped. And a few died, and their graves are there, by the cedars. Yes, they had brave hearts." And Oscar lifted his hat as though he were saluting the lost legion. They turned again to the road and went forward at a gallop, until, half a mile from the gate, They came upon a clearing and a low, red-roofed bungalow.
"Your house, sir."
And Oscar swung himself down at the steps of a broad veranda. He led the horses away to a barn beyond the house, while Armitage surveyed the landscape. The bungalow stood on a rough knoll, and was so placed as to afford a splendid view of a wide region. Armitage traversed the long veranda, studying the landscape and delighting in the far-stretching, pine-covered barricade of hills. He was aroused by Oscar, who appeared carrying the suitcases.
"There shall be breakfast," said the man.
He threw open the doors and they entered a wide, bare hall with a fireplace, into which Oscar dropped a match.
"All one floor. Plenty of sleeping rooms, sir. A place to eat here, a kitchen beyond. A fair barracks for a common soldier. That is all."
"It is enough. Throw these bags into the nearest bedroom, if there is no choice, and camp will be established."
"This is yours. The baggage that came by express is there. A wagon goes with the place, and I brought the things up yesterday. There is a shower bath beyond the rear veranda. The mountain water is off the ice, but you will require hot water for shaving, is it not so?"
"You oppress me with luxuries, Oscar. Wind up the clock and nothing will be wanting." Oscar unstrapped the trunks and then stood at attention in the door. He had expected Armitage to condemn the place in bitter language, but the proprietor of the abandoned hunting preserve was in excellent spirits, and whistled blithely as he drew out his keys.
"The place was built by fools," declared Oscar gloomily.
"Undoubtedly. There is a saying that fools build houses, and wise men live in them. You see where that leaves us, Oscar. Let us be cheerful." He tried the shower and changed his raiment, while Oscar prepared coffee and laid a cloth on the long table before the fire. When Armitage appeared, coffee steamed in the tin pot in which it had been made. Bacon, eggs, and toast were further offered. "You have done excellently well, Oscar. Go get your own breakfast." Armitage dropped a lump of sugar into his cup of coffee and surveyed the room. A large map of Virginia and a series of hunting prints hung on the untinted walls, and there were racks for guns, and a workbench at the end of the room, where guns might be taken apart and cleaned. A few novels, several 3-year-old magazines, and a variety of pipes remained on the shelf above the fireplace. The house offered possibilities of meager comfort, and that was about all. Armitage remembered what the agent through whom he had made the purchase had said. The place had proved too isolated for even a hunting preserve, and that its only value was in the timber. He was satisfied with his bargain, and would not set up a lumber mill yet awhile. He lighted a cigar and settled himself in an easy-chair before the fire, glad of the luxury of peace and quiet after his circuitous journey and the tumult of doubt and question that had shaken him. He slit the wrapper of the Washington newspaper that Oscar had brought from the mountain post office, and scanned the headlines. He read with care a dispatch from London that purported to reflect the sentiment of the continental capitals toward Charles Louis, the new Emperor King of Austria-Hungary, and the paper dropped upon his knees, and he stared into the fire. Then he picked up a paper of earlier date, and read all the foreign dispatches and the news of Washington. He was about to toss the paper aside, when his eyes fell upon a boldly headlined article that caused his heart to throb fiercely. It recited the sudden reappearance of the fraudulent Baron von Kissel in Washington, and described in detail the Baron's escapades at Bar Harbor and his later career in California and elsewhere. Then followed a story, veiled in careful phrases, but based, so the article recited, upon information furnished by a gentleman of extensive acquaintance on both sides of the Atlantic, that Baron von Kissel, under a new pseudonym, and with even more daring effrontery, had within a fortnight sought to entrench himself in the most exclusive circles of Washington. Armitage's cigar slipped from his fingers and fell upon the brick hearth as he read. The boldness of this clever adventurer is said to have reached a climax in this city within a few days. He had, under the name of Armitage, palmed himself off upon members of one of the most distinguished families of the capital, whom he had met abroad during the winter. A young gentleman of this family, who, it will suffice to say, bears a commission and title from the American government, entertained a small company of friends at a Washington club only a few nights ago, and this plausible adventurer was among the guests. He was recognized at once by one of the foreigners present, who, out of consideration for the host and fellow guests, held his tongue. But it is understood that this gentleman sought Armitage privately and warned him to leave Washington, which accounts for the fact that the sumptuous apartments of the New American in which Mr. John Armitage, alias Baron von Kissel, had established himself were vacated immediately. None of those present at the supper will talk of the matter, but it has been the subject of lively gossip for several days, and the German embassy is said to have laid before the Washington police all the information in its archives relating to the American adventures of this impudent scoundrel. Armitage rose, dropped the paper into the fire, and, with his elbow resting on the mantel-shelf, watched it burn. He laughed suddenly and faced about, his back to the flames. Oscar stood at attention in the middle of the room. "Shall we unpack? Yes?" "It is a capital idea," said John Armitage. "I was a striker for my captain also, who had 14 pairs of boots and a bad disposition, and his uniforms, yes? He was very pretty to look at on a horse." "The ideal is high, Oscar, but I shall do my best. That one first, please." The contents of the 2 trunks were disposed of deftly by Oscar as Armitage directed. One of the bedrooms was utilized as a closet, and garments for every imaginable occasion were brought forth. There were stout English tweeds for the heaviest weather, 2 dress suits, and Norfolk jackets in corduroy. The owner's taste ran to grays and browns, it seemed, and he whimsically ordered his raiment grouped by colors as he lounged about with a pipe in his mouth. "You may hang those scarfs on the string provided by my predecessor, Sergeant. They will help our color scheme. That pale blue doesn't blend well in our rainbow. Put it in your pocket and wear it, with my compliments. And those tan shoes are not bad for the Virginian mud. Drop them here. Those gray campaign hats are comfortable. Give the oldest to me. And there is a riding cloak I had forgotten I ever owned. I gave gold for it to a Madrid tailor. The mountain nights are cool, and the thing may serve me well," he added whimsically. He clapped on the hat and flung the cloak upon his shoulders. It fell to his heels, and he gathered it together with one hand at the waist and strutted out into the hall, whither Oscar followed, staring as Armitage began to declaim, "Give me my robe, put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me. 'Tis an inky cloak, as dark as Hamlet's mind. I will go forth upon a bloody business, and who hinders me shall know the bitter taste of death. Oscar, by faith of my body, you shall be the Horatio of the tragedy. Set me right afore the world if treason be my undoing, and while we await the trumpets, cast that silly pair of trousers as rubbish to the void, and choose of mine own raiment as thou wouldst, knave. And now, nothing can we call our own but death, and that small model of the barren earth which serves as paste to cover our bones. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings." Then he grew serious, tossed the cloak and hat upon a bench that ran around the room, and refilled and lighted his pipe. Oscar, soberly unpacking, saw Armitage pace the hall floor for an hour, deep in thought. "Oscar," he called abruptly, "how far is it down to Storm Springs?" "A forced march, and you are there in an hour and a half, sir." End of chapter 12.